Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Pearson's Insight Webinar 18 by a Guide to Endpoint Assessment. If this is your first Insight webinar, we hope you find it a useful experience. If you've attended one before, then welcome back. So who are your presenters today? We have Ellen Duggan, our Apprenticeship Service Manager, and Liz Bennett, who is Head of our Endpoint Assessment Delivery. So with that, I'll hand you over to Ellen.
Thank you, Lauren. So first of all, I'll just give you an overview of Pearson. As Lauren said, some of you may have well joined in some of our webinars previously, but in terms of who we are a leading provider of work-based and vocational learning content and qualifications. So you might know us already through our brands such as EdXL, BTEC or Pearson College, Pearson TQ or Pearson View. We work closely with trailblazer groups in a range of sectors and support the development of new apprenticeship standards to provide advice on assessments and on grading as well. We are an EPA organisation. We're one of the largest registered EPAOs on the ESFA register, and we are currently approved for EPAs in 35 standards. We've been delivering EPAs to levy-paying employers, such as yourselves, since April 2017. And to date, we've delivered over 800 EPAs in a range of standards, and we have a pipeline of over 4,000 EPAs to deliver over the next couple of years. Obviously, it's EPA that we are focused on today. Specifically, we're going to go through, this is the agenda for today, so we're going to go through an overview of EPA, and we'll talk to you about endpoint assessment organisations. We'll talk a little bit about delivery models, and of course your role, so the employer's role with regards to selecting an endpoint assessment organisation, and also some considerations for your role before, during and after EPA. We'll then just cover a few best practice and just recap as well before questions at the end of the webinar. So what is EPA? So all apprenticeship standards must have an EPA. This assessment is carried out by an independent registered EPA organisation, and that EPAO has to be approved by the ESFA to conduct EPA for that specific standard. EPA is the final assessment for an apprentice. It validates that the apprentice has achieved the knowledge, the skills and the behaviours of the apprenticeship, and of course they can't achieve the apprenticeship without passing that EPA. So it really does give you, the employer, confidence that the apprentice is occupationally competent and ready for the job that they have undertaken the training for. Every apprenticeship standard has an assessment plan, so that's been written by the Trailblazer Group, which is supported by the IFA. And this assessment plan determines the requirements of the EPA and the components that it's made up of. And the EPAO must adhere to that assessment plan when designing, developing, and of course delivering the EPA. So EPA is completely separate to and independent from the on-programme training and any qualifications or assessment that the apprentice may have taken part in during the on-programme. In terms of EPA format and delivery, so EPA can take different forms depending on the apprenticeship standard. An EPA will contain at least 2 components. It could contain as many as 5. And these components are determined by the employer group in the assessment plan. So some examples could include a practical observation in the workplace, maybe a professional discussion, a multiple choice test or a short answer test, practical assessment perhaps, an evidence portfolio, maybe a presentation or structured interview. So there are lots of different assessments and techniques that are used in EPA. Also, EPA components can take place face-to-face, so that's with the independent endpoint assessor attending the apprentice's place of work to carry out the assessment, but obviously through technology and where appropriate. Some components can take place remotely as well, and that's something to consider when looking at EPA. It's important really to think about those logistical considerations when you're thinking about EPA as well, and think about those in advance and discuss them with your EPA organisation. And your EPA organisation will really be able to advise you on the most effective way to schedule and to deliver your EPAs. For example, if you are doing a practical observation in the workplace as part of the EPA, you might want to consider what the most appropriate time of day or the day of the week to schedule the EPA, because you really want to give the apprentice the best opportunity to demonstrate their knowledge and skills and behaviours. You might want to consider if you'll need to obtain any consent beforehand, perhaps from customers or patients. And also in terms of independent endpoint assessor entering your premises, will they need any particular access passes? Will they need any particular attire or uniform? These are all considerations which are really important to think about before the EPA. So essentially it's 100% your decision as the employer to put an apprentice forward for EPA. Once you are fully confident and the apprentice is confident that they are ready and competent, then you can then put them forward for EPA. And we'll talk a little bit more about what your role in EPA as the employer is and what your kind of responsibilities are shortly. So in terms of results and certification, so once the EPA has been completed, EPA organisation will send you a notification of results, and then they will also apply for the apprentice certificate directly from the ESFA. That certificate will then come directly from the ESFA to you, the employer, to then pass on to the apprentice. So we'll talk a little bit now about endpoint assessment organisations, or EPAOs. The ESFA Register of EPAOs. This is a list of approved endpoint assessment organisations for each particular standard. Before being accepted onto the register, the EPAO has to demonstrate that they have the relevant occupational experience of the standard. They also need to prove that it has the relevant assessment experience and expertise and ability to deliver at the expected scale as well, which is obviously a really important consideration. I'm going to hand over to my colleague Liz now, who's going to speak a little bit more about the role of an EPAO.
Thank you, Ellen. So EPAO responsibilities, there are a number. We are solely accountable and responsible for the delivery of every endpoint assessment, and that's a really important point as we work collaboratively with providers and employers. We are still accountable for that delivery. Once we have been approved on the ESFA's register, we will design relevant assessment instruments from the apprenticeship standard and the assessment plan that have been written by the Trailblazer Group. And we ensure that those standards are reflected very clearly in our instruments that will then be used by the endpoint assessors. We also develop specifications and additional resources to support the training provider, the employer and the apprentice, so they understand very clearly as to what's expected of them in the EPA. We're responsible for the endpoint assessors, or we refer to them as IEAs, independent endpoint assessors. So we're responsible for finding the right people with the right background and expertise. So we're there to source them, train and standardise them, and then make sure that they are supported throughout their EPAs and quality assured. So we are responsible for that internal quality assurance aspect, and then we're also responsible for adhering to any external quality assurance requirements. So essentially we are under scrutiny by external bodies who are named generally in the assessment plan, and there are several of those that might include Ofqual, the Institute for Apprenticeships, professional bodies and employer bodies as well. So it's important for us to develop relationships with those bodies and understand their particular requirements. And then when it comes to any audits and quality assurance activities, that we're able to demonstrate compliance with those. Underpinning endpoint assessment is the fact that each and every one of those assessments has to be independent. So managing conflicts of interest is key to all of this. And again, being able to demonstrate how we manage those conflicts of interest to those who are interested. So it is those EQA bodies, the Institute for Apprenticeships, that oversees the quality of the whole apprenticeship system. And then, of course, the Education Skills Funding Agency, who will themselves undertake those audits based on our registered status. Before we actually start the delivery of the EPAs, we have to work closely with the right experts to bring that assessment to life, make sure it does everything it's meant to do, that it's providing a valid and fit for purpose assessment of the occupational competence that has been reflected in that apprenticeship standard and the assessment plan, and that the assessments will deliver reliable outcomes. We have to make sure, as we would do with our qualifications as well, that those assessments are fair to all apprentices and that they do enable them to progress further following that endpoint assessment. And another key point of bringing all this assessment to life and interpreting the assessment plans and the apprenticeship standards is making sure that that assessment is manageable and it makes sense for you as the employer and also to the apprentice, and also to the wider industry as well, to make sure that it does what it's meant to do effectively and efficiently. So we have a long history of developing assessments and qualifications. So every development is underpinned by those same design and development principles and processes. As I mentioned, we need to make sure that we have the right kind of expertise involved in that development as well. Employer input, assessment input, and testing along the way is really important to make sure that EPA is fit for purpose. Working collaboratively throughout the development process is absolutely key to all of this, to make sure that the EPA is fit for purpose. And when it comes to designing the quality assurance model, we ensure that we take a risk-based approach to that. The assessors that we recruit are managed it's a red, amber, green system that we use. It's a risk-based approach and they're supported accordingly. These EPAs are brand new, so they can be seen as high risk. So there's a lot of scrutiny up front and with remote sampling and accompanied visits and observations as well of those assessors. We provide regular training and standardisation activity for the assessors and for the internal quality assurers who have a team of assessors each. Making sure that our assessors and our IQAs maintain their currency within the industry is absolutely key as well. They are expected to reflect the occupational profile of the apprentices they are assessing. So we require evidence of their continuous professional development throughout the year in order for them to maintain their contract with us. Being able to report those key findings, the management information as well, following the EPA is something that we can provide you as the employer and the provider if you are working with one. And of course, in terms of our role as an EPAO, that type of data is then shared externally with EQA bodies, the IFA and the ESFA. And we always want to hear from you following your EPAs as well. We're always looking for continuous improvement. So we will have debriefs with you following your EPAs and we'll be wanting to keep in touch with you throughout. If we have a look now at the EPA delivery models and the kind of options we have. There isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. Every sector is different, every EPA is different, and we need to reflect that in terms of how we work with employers and providers to identify and procure the most relevant resources essentially for each EPA. And we might take a direct delivery approach where we recruit and contract endpoint assessors directly and we manage those assessors throughout, or we might look for partnerships with organisations that have the right kind of capacity and capability and can provide those experts to us. At all times we are fully accountable, as I said, for that endpoint assessment, but there are different approaches to actually identifying and managing the resources. And your EPAO will always be able to guide you on the most effective model for the EPA in question. An active example of flexible delivery model is our current partnership with Centrica plc, where we've been working very closely with them since our first EPA started with them in 2017. The partnership is with British Gas, which is part of the Centrica Group companies, and they work with us as a trusted EPAO to develop fit-for-purpose EPAs for different standards. For example, for the customer service practitioner standard, Pearson have adopted a fully direct delivery model where we source, train and contract our endpoint assessors, as opposed to a model we use for dual fuel smart meter installer, where British Gas are able to put forward their own technical experts who we work with as assessors and IQAs. And there is an allowance for that within the assessment plan. And we manage that process, we provide the quality assurance framework around that, but we can work in a slightly different way. So we always have to think about what we can do with the assessment plan and the flexibility within that, but it's always about the best approach when it comes to resources and assessment expertise. In both cases with British Gas, as part of our contract, we provide regular reporting and data analysis to support both of those standards, and that would be the case if working with you as well. And that allows us to feed into ongoing improvements from a delivery perspective, but also for their overall delivery and wider business needs. I'm going to hand over to Ellen again now.
Thank you, Liz. So we're going to spend a bit of time now looking at your role, the employer's role in EPA, really covering points such as selecting your EPAO, some of the considerations and your role before EPA, on the day of EPA, and also after EPA. So selecting an EPAO. So whilst EPA comes at the end, it's synoptic in nature, the selection of your EPAO should be considered from the very start of your apprenticeship programme. There are some EPAs which contain components such as evidence collation or project presentation or perhaps employer references, which really need to be considered or even collated during the apprenticeship programme. Your selected EPAO can work closely with you and the training provider to really support you on the process and provide support and, of course, resources to help you prepare your apprentice for EPA. Now, employers can choose any organisation listed on the register, as we mentioned previously. If you want to use an EPA organisation that's not currently on the register for that apprenticeship standard, they may well be on for another standard, but not the one that you particularly want to go with, then the EPAO must apply and be approved before you can kind of go forward with contracting them. And the EPAO must maintain independence from the training provider, and that's something that obviously is really important in terms of conflict of interest. So the training provider cannot act also as the EPAO. So selecting the right endpoint assessment organisation, or EPAO, at the beginning of the apprenticeship is really important. And whilst in reality it's likely that your training provider might well recommend a particular EPAO to you, ultimately it's your decision to make as the employer, and there will be several considerations which will help you to choose the right EPAO for your organisation, and we'll go through some of those considerations shortly. You might find that for some standards you'll have a large number of EPAOs to choose from on the register, whereas other standards you might only have one or two EPAs to decide from. It really depends on the standard. And whilst each EPAO must deliver the EPAs in adherence to the assessment plan and according to any regulations, every EPAO is different and can offer you a range of services and support and resources for EPA. So when deciding on which EPAO is right for your organisation and for your requirements, we put together here just some considerations and questions which you might want to ask a potential EPAO. So you might want to look at the types of resources and support which will be available to the line manager, to the training provider and to the apprentice in order to help prepare for EPA. You might want to consider what technology solutions the EPAO has. Will it provide you with kind of the reporting that you need and the monitoring and any visibility that you might need? And also looking at the EPAO's experience in delivering EPAs in the standard that you're looking at, and also in your industry sector. So do they have a good understanding of your business? Will the EPAO be able to deliver in your required locations and at your required scale? And what is the process and timeline for notification of results? What's their policy on reassessments? Pricing, obviously going to be one of the top considerations, but looking at both the pricing for first attempt and also any reassessments to be included in there as well. And then you might also want to consider what other standards the EPAO is registered for. So you may have further needs within your organisation currently, or there may well be some additional needs in the future. So that's obviously worth a consideration there. So this list is by no means exhaustive. So, you know, we're not kind of telling you all the different questions that you need to ask, but it's really just some considerations to have a think about. And of course, you'll probably have some questions which are specific to your organisation. But hopefully the responses that you get to your questions will help you make an informed choice then about which EPA organisation is right for you and right for your organisation and for the standard. And then you can involve them early on in your apprenticeship journey. So once you've now selected your EPAO, which is great, there are now some key considerations to bear in mind before, during and after the EPA. So I'm going to pass you back over to Liz to talk to you a little bit more about what to think about before EPA and then on the day of the EPA and also once EPA has been completed.
Thank you very much. As employers, you have an important role in assessing the competency of your apprentice. So before EPA takes place, there's a really important stage called the gateway, which needs to be undertaken. That needs to happen at least 12 months after the start of that on-programme period, but longer, depending on the standard in question. It's your responsibility at that stage to agree with the apprentice, and you can have the input from the training provider as well, as to whether that apprentice is ready to undertake that EPA. And you need to be thinking also about what happens if you don't feel that they're ready and what additional support might be needed. What does it mean for their particular contract and within the ESFA funding rules? So you need to be thinking about the timing, also thinking about how long to include for that EPA period in case there are any reassessments that might be required. So do think about the fact if your apprentice is on a fixed term contract, what that might mean when it comes to their endpoint assessment, and build in that time. Work closely with your training provider if you're working with one, and the EPAO to really support the apprentice and prepare for their EPA. And that could involve doing some mock assessments, and the EPAO might be able to provide you with some resources in relation to that. Also get them used to the type of environment that they will be engaging with at the endpoint assessment. Involve individuals from your organisation in professional discussions with them if that's relevant to the EPA, so that they're able to develop their confidence really when it comes to talking to someone that they're not familiar with. They would have developed a close familiarity with their assessors and their trainers on programme, but the endpoint assessor is going to feel quite different to that type of relationship. They're coming in as a completely independent party. They're assessing what they see on the day. No other sources of information can be used. So it's important that that apprentice is aware of that difference and has been able to practice as well with the different types of assessment methods. We also have to think about the logistical arrangements for EPA, and as the EPA, we are responsible for that endpoint assessment. But it might be that you want different components to take place in different locations. So we need these discussions ahead of time so we can understand if, for example, your EPA has an on-screen test, where will that test be taking place? Who will be invigilating it? If you're working with a college or a training provider, would you be asking to use one of their rooms, for example, and one of their invigilators? Or would you want to use a space in your own organisation? If you do, then we need to be able to set up the technology and the resources to do that. Or you may ask that the EPAO provides that resource and technology for you. And then when it comes to the other components, whether it's an observation or a professional discussion or interview, where are those going to take place? And the observation normally takes place in a live working environment. So you need to be thinking about what that means for the apprentice and the other people that they would normally be working with, or the patients or customers that they would normally be interacting with. You may prefer to take a chance of booking that apprentice off their shift so they can focus on their EPA on that date rather than them doing it as part of their shift. Just thinking about safeguarding arrangements as well, depending on the age of the apprentice, thinking about who might need to accompany that apprentice and that assessor in the work location, and then making sure that you have the rooms available for any verbal discussion with the assessor as well. And again, any of those components might take place within your workplace, or they might be taking place in the training provider. So between the three parties, it's important that we have that agreement up front so we know exactly who needs to be where and at what time, and that the apprentice is very clear as to what's expected and where they need to be. We, as the EPAO, will provide you with all the guidance you need, and we'd be checking in with you and the provider at various points leading up to that endpoint assessment. We'd be introducing you to the endpoint assessor as well to finalise some of those logistics ahead of the day. But the key point is just thinking about the most efficient use of resources and the assessor's time, and making it work for you as the employer and for the apprentice. Now, on the day of the EPA, in some standards, there is an allowance for the employer to be involved in that endpoint assessment, and that isn't to make an assessment decision, but for example, in the policy officer EPA, the assessment plan allows for an employer representative to be part of the interview panel, and that's to provide technical information where and if necessary. As I mentioned, it's not to make any decisions, but it's feeding into that assessment process. So we as the EPAO need to take on board any requirements such as those in the design of the assessment, and again plan those activities in with you, and make sure everyone is aware of what type of input they can provide as part of that assessment. But whether or not you're directly involved in the EPA component, you do need to understand what is required, and everything I've just mentioned in terms of the considerations beforehand. You need to be able to support that on the day of the assessment. And also think about appointing a relevant member of staff for the day, and that's not just to accompany the apprentice and the assessor, but also thinking about the support for the apprentice, whether they do need that moral support at the end, and might just want to be able to go and have a chat with someone once it's all finished. When the EPA has come to an end, you will receive the results from the endpoint assessment organisation. Now, the SLAs may vary. Pearson provides the results to you within 5 working days of the assessment, and that's following the internal quality assurance. And on successful completion, the certificate will be sent directly from the ESFA to you, and for you to pass that on to the apprentice. The training provider will close the apprentice's ILR based on the date that we send the results to you. You need to be thinking, however, what happens next after that EPA. It's worth considering what that means for your organisation and for the apprentice, and that's for every grade. What happens if the apprentice has not achieved that EPA? What type of support will be put in place? What's your position on reassessments? How many do you want us to provide? In some cases, the number of reassessments is set within an assessment plan, but in many cases there is flexibility there. But what does that mean to the organisation if someone does not achieve? And what does it mean if they achieve a merit or distinction? Is that linked to a particular progression route, for example? So it's important that you can provide that kind of clarity and guidance to the apprentices as well. And I mentioned earlier, it's important for us to find out how it went for you on the day of the EPA and gather your feedback, so we as an EPAO are able to continuously improve our service to you. I'm going to hand back to Ellen.
Thank you, Liz. So hopefully those points that Liz just gone through and that we've discussed already, it's kind of demonstrated to you the power of collaboration really between your selected EPAO training provider and yourself as the employer in terms of helping to deliver and supporting to deliver a successful EPA. Pearson's approach then, so we've adopted a collaborative approach to working on the apprenticeship new standards. We know that new apprenticeship delivery is complex, it's constantly evolving and changing, and we really do believe that a genuine partnership with open dialogue, with employers, with training providers and with EPAOs is the way forward to ensure that high quality apprenticeships are delivered from beginning to end in every single sector. So as I mentioned before, we've been delivering EPAs to levy paying employers since 2017. We've delivered over 800 to date. We learn something new from pretty much every single EPA that we do, because we understand that each employer and each training provider is different. So we really do aim to work collaboratively to understand your requirements as the employer, the training provider's requirements, but also adhering to all the regulations that we need to as an EPAO, and obviously undertaking our responsibility as an EPA organisation very seriously too. So we've just got here one of our customers, an employer provider, a quote here to say that in collaboration found Pearson to be receptive to feedback, and together collaboratively our knowledge and understanding has grown and is allowing us to develop as a confident EPA centre. And that's essentially what we want from all of our partners. So to recap some important points which hopefully you'll take away from today's webinar. So really just about engaging any potential EPAOs as early as possible. So select your EPAO and then benefit from the maximum amount of support and resources that they're able to offer you in order to prepare for EPA. They can guide you through all the different steps that are needed before that on the day of EPA. There's no one-size-fits-all approach to EPA, so again, collaboration is key, and that's working with your training provider but also with your selected EPAO. So whilst EPA is indeed at the end of the apprenticeship programme, for some of you who are just considering starting off your apprenticeship programme right now, it might seem like a long way away, but it really shouldn't be the last thing that you think of, because the more engaged you are with your EPAO from the very start, the more support than that EPAO can provide to you. Another point, obviously, we've mentioned this a couple of times now, it's your decision as the employer to select your EPAO, and that's one of your key responsibilities there. And also in terms of best practice, sharing feedback with your EPAO and of course with your training provider, that helps us to inform continuous improvement.
There's a question. So what kind of resources do you provide for employers to help them prepare their apprentices for EPA?
The resources provided for free when you register for the EPA is an EPA specification, and that provides a really clear breakdown of every single part of the endpoint assessment and the endpoint assessment process. So it provides content that can be used during the on-programme phase to help develop the apprentice's skills, knowledge and behaviours against the particular apprenticeship standard. So we've essentially developed that additional content to support that. And you also have the grading criteria and clarity as to what's expected for each of those included in the specification as well. So that will help the apprentices to prepare for their endpoint assessment in more detail. Depending on the EPA in question, we might provide templates, particular briefs for the apprentices. We also provide the relevant forms that need to be completed and submitted alongside the apprentice's evidence. We have paid for resources as well that are available to support the apprentice on programme, and we're looking at other materials as we speak that can just keep enhancing that experience as we learn from our first EPAs. And we also provide what we refer to as sample assessment materials for multiple choice and short answer tests, and that allows the provider, employer and the apprentice to get a feel for the type of questions that will be included in such a test.
Brilliant, thank you. And we've got one more. A lot of providers we are engaging with have already identified an endpoint assessment organisation. As an employer, can we say we would prefer an alternative one if we have a strong feeling about the chosen one?
Absolutely, you can. As we mentioned earlier, it is your choice, and it's important to make an informed choice as we've been talking about so far.
So just to let you all know, there won't be any more Insight webinars for the rest of 2018. Check back with us in the new year because we will be doing some next year. You can keep in touch with us via Twitter or LinkedIn, or you can sign up for our Insight newsletter. It goes out each month. It is aimed at employers, but there is another one aimed at colleges and centres. So make sure you sign up to the one relevant to you. So that does conclude today's webinar. Thank you all for attending, and we hope to see you again in future instalments.